Now we come to the Dutch House, Ann Patchett's The Dutch House. Ann Patchett is most certainly one of America's most beloved writers. You will all remember Bel Canto and Commonwealth and State of Wonder. We have done all of those three of her books. And I have to say that if we continue on with the live season or not, we will probably do The Dutch House in its entirety as a review. This is her 8th novel. And I was thinking this morning that mostly the taglines for books these days are startling or controversial or provocative or challenging. That isn't Ann Patchett. She is charming and graceful and thoughtful and a genuine pleasure to read all of the time. She invites us into her world. And here, like Commonwealth, it's a multi-generational family, and it's seen over a stretch of 5 decades. Recollected by the narrator, the narrative voice on the page, who is Danny Conroy. Danny pieces together the stories he remembers and thinks about and treasures, in fact, about his life, but mainly about his sister, his main support, insightful, strong, resourceful Maeve. 7 years his senior, his protector always, who is really at the heart, and I do mean the heart of this novel. The strength and the spirit she is of this delightful and sometimes devastated, interdependent twosome, a relationship between an older sister and a younger brother. And if you like, you can think of them as the Hansel and Gretel of this story. And yes, they are expelled, and please forgive me, I'm going to use that expression, into the woods. And they're expelled by a cruel stepmother to find their path all alone, without resources, either financial or emotionally supportive. These 2 kids alone in the metaphoric woods, the journey through life, which they do together, mainly under Maeve's guidance and her support. But the Dutch house of the title is not a gingerbread house. It's given its name, and it's a name that the whole of the community where the house exists in Philadelphia, it's been given that name by the whole community. They all call it the Dutch House on the Hill. But it's called the Dutch House not because of its architecture, but rather because of the memory of the first owners who built this enormous, sprawling, elegant, multi-windowed mansion. And by multi-window, please don't think of many little windows. These are great big storefront windows. You can see, if you could see, into the house very easily. And the kids do that, actually. It was built in the 1920s, elevated on a high hill by Mr. and Mrs. Van Hobeek. Mr. and Mrs. Van Hobeek are from the Netherlands. Hence the Dutch house. It's an ornate mansion, and the narration beckons the reader in with wonderful opulence of detail about every single room, precise details about the ballroom and the overstuffed furniture and the winding staircases and the marble flooring and the gilt ceilings, and the dark, neglected downstairs into which no one ventures until someone does. And I'll leave that in without going on with that. But looming in the hallway, looming over everyone who enters the house, are 2 very formal portraits in gilt, hanging there, of Mr. and Mrs. Van Hobeek. And they look over anyone who comes in, and they are never taken out. They are left hanging by Danny's father, who buys the house without telling his wife that he's buying it, and finally brings her there and says, and they have no children yet, this is where we're going to live. He leaves the portraits in the hall. That's the lineage of the house, and they belong in the house. To those portraits is added a similarly gilt-framed heavy portrait of Maeve. And Maeve is wearing her cloak. And that's the actual cover portrait that's on the cover of the Dutch house in probably every one of your editions. What happens is that eventually Maeve doesn't want that portrait of herself to remain in the house. She steals it in a very rare visit back to the house when she's an adult, and she gives it to Danny. Danny keeps it, but he gives it to his daughter May, named for his sister Mauve, because in fact the portrait looks absolutely just like May. And so it hangs there through all kinds of manifestations of generations. It hangs there when he brings to the family a sparkly young widow who comes with 2 children. And of course, that widow becomes the wicked stepmother when Danny and Maeve's mother summarily leaves. And she leaves the house saying, I never belonged there. I didn't belong with the staircase, and I didn't belong with the carpets, and I didn't belong with the ceilings. I never wanted to live in that house. And off she goes to, quote, do good works, that's her words, in India, picking up and going and leaving the 2 children and her husband, however, in the very good care of the family retainers who had been there since the house was built in the 1920s. And that's the most wonderful of housekeepers and cook who look after the children as they are growing up until the stepmother arrives with her 2 daughters. The 2 daughters, however, are not the ugly stepdaughters. They're delightful, and they're very good being a blended family, were it not, of course, for the arrival of Andrea. Maeve and Danny's father likes the house. He loves the house. He sees no evil anywhere. And so he tries to make this a blended family. But as the portraits remain, they look down on a woman who is manipulative and not caring of the 2 children in her care. And so when Maeve goes off to university, she is summarily told, don't bother coming back. And she doesn't, not really. She never lives in the Dutch house again. Several years later, Danny, having remained in the family when his father dies of a heart attack, is also set packing. And so with 1 suitcase, we are told, he is sent packing with 1 suitcase. And so he and his sister are now alone, penniless. The only thing they have left of the wealth that they had is a college fund for Danny that cannot be touched. The children must rely on each other. They do. And so they go on a journey together into adulthood. And the house remains standing. Through the years, the Dutch house and childhood memories of the Dutch house remain with the siblings. They begin to surreptitiously revisit the house, first in thought, in memory that they exchange, and ultimately they do go and peer into the windows and see what the new family is doing. And in one visit, Maeve actually steals the portrait of herself which will be hung in the hall when Danny buys the house after Andrea has slipped into senility and died. So what we have is a very engrossing family saga. The word I should not be using is engrossing. I should say enchanting, because of course the book has been very much called a fairy tale by reviewers. I think it's much more than that. First of all, there are wonderful references to other childhood books that you'll all pick up. The Turn of the Screw, Henry James, Huckleberry Finn, wonderful references to Kill a Mockingbird. We follow Danny and Maeve over 5 decades into adulthood. We watch both of them graduate from college, Danny get married. We watch Maeve's death, of course, and a niece to bear her name. And we also see the twosome struggling. They struggle with poverty. They struggle with difficulties of all sorts, including health issues, but they handle the emotional losses and the struggles together, and that's very important. Always interdependent, a devoted pair, Danny and Maeve, Hansel and Gretel. And we are swept along in that narration. And we are swept along into the Dutch house itself, because the brother and sister never really lose their whole world in that Dutch house. It matters to them, and their memories matter to them. Danny's narration resonates. He thinks of this a great deal and waits until the day comes when, in fact, the Dutch house can become part of his life again. What I really want to say is that this is a novel of empathy. It's about stories and, of course, about storytelling. And it's about childhood and youth, but it's also about the fact that the memories we hold and we retell are told through the lens of our adulthood. And you watch that happen beautifully. It's about the family portraits, metaphorically, the roles that people play in each other's lives and in shaping those lives. And it's about the imposing, large, immense indeed, house that was witness to all of that. I don't think it's a fairy tale. At the end of the novel, Danny says, we look back at the past through the windows of the present, seeing that as the people we are now. The Dutch house is quite simply an irresistible read. You know, it's like they always say, if you only have one book to read. Well, perhaps this might be one of them, though I'm probably going to say that about every one of these books. But it's full of compassion, and it's got her signature, her thumbprint, that insight and her penchant for forgiveness. We would expect no less than the perfect read from Ann Patchett. Thank you so much for being here with me in my kitchen. Thank you for listening as I spoke about books I have so much enjoyed in the last 3.5 months. And I certainly hope that some of them will become your favorites too.